Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I'm your host, Benedict Hein. If you are new to the show, welcome. So glad to have you. If you are already a listener, welcome back. Stoked to still have you. And if you are watching this on YouTube, just know that this is a podcast you can actually listen to on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you enjoy podcasts. And if you discovered us on one of those apps, also know that you can watch this on YouTube. So this is a show that we use to help you make better recordings, and we tell you what we would do in certain situations, how we address certain things, how we do it, basically. We walk you through this on the show. If you need help actually implementing this, and if you want to know how this applies to your own music, to your own recordings, and if you've been struggling with that and you think like you don't need more information, but actually someone to walk you through this and show you how you can do this, then go to the selfrecordingband.com/call and book a free coaching call with me, because we have a coaching program that is designed to walk you through all the steps of the music production process, and we can have a chat about whether or not this is a good fit for you. So go to the selfrecordingband.com/call and book your free first call today. This episode today is about something that we come across pretty often when we receive files to mix, and that is tracks that have not been cleaned up properly. You know, the beginnings and endings are not trimmed, or there's noise or rumble in between parts. There are clicks and pops from comping, or from comping, cutting, or trimming parts. And sometimes we even find these issues in tracks that have been edited by the artist. So they fix the timing and tuning issues maybe, but they haven't paid enough attention to that cleanup phase. And it's a very basic editing step that absolutely needs to be done. That is pretty easy to learn. You just need to know some basic tools and techniques. And I know we've done episodes on editing in the past, but this one's in this case, we're talking about some really basic techniques and a much simpler editing step that every DIY producer can and should learn right away. So let's get into this, and we'll walk you through why this matters and what to do about it. As always, I'm joined by my co-host and friend, Malcom Owen Flood. How are you, Malcom?
Hey, Benny. I'm great, man. How are you?
I'm great too. Thank you. Awesome. So this is another one of those episodes that seem pretty trivial, pretty basic, but is a pretty important thing to talk about still, right?
Yeah. I mean, I just finished, I think this is relevant. I just finished, I think, five songs I got to do last week mixing, and they were all from people that listen to this podcast, which is really cool. And I love working with people that listen to this podcast because every time they send me something, the tracks are better. Like, they're always improving, they're always learning. But on a couple of them, this cleanup stage was totally missed. So it's like, we have to talk about this. We haven't drilled this in enough yet. And it's like, nobody's in trouble. We're not mad at anybody, but it is something that people need to be aware of, because there are potentially negative consequences to not cleaning up your tracks properly before they go for mixing. In a perfect world, all of that stuff will get caught before it's released, but there's still downsides to it existing once it goes to mixing. I think it's very relevant, and it's extremely easy. This isn't going to be a challenging episode to implement. It just might be something you weren't even aware that you need to do, and it also might be something that you don't know how to even spot that the problem exists. So we'll cover all of that today.
Awesome. Excited. And please know that this is not just something for like the beginners in the audience. I've mixed stuff for people who actually know what they're doing. They produce really great sounding music, and they record great sounding raw tracks. They even edit and they do the editing and everything themselves, and it sounds great, but they still miss these things sometimes. So even if you're experienced and you think this is very basic stuff, pay attention, because you might still not be doing this, or at least not properly. All right. So I don't know. For some reason, I skipped the banter today, Malcom. Is there anything we need to talk about before we actually get into it?
Let's just get into it. Let's give it to him.
All right. Perfect. One thing, let's start with why this actually matters. One thing is, of course, you don't want anything in there that is obviously distracting. So if there's a pause, like a break in your song, or it's something where there's just noise or rumble present that doesn't belong to the song, that's the most obvious thing. Just get rid of that stuff. If it's like clearly audible, if you don't do this but you know how to do it, you're just lazy, or you're just not paying attention enough to those details. Just take it seriously and take it serious enough and get rid of the stuff that doesn't belong to the music. That's one thing. But there's more to it. So there might be things that you don't hear when you're listening to the whole song, but it's still there, and it might become audible in the mix. It might come up, it might become more present and then actually distracting once the track is mixed. And so that is one reason.
Why don't we give a couple examples of what those sort of noises might be? What's your biggest pet peeve of uncleaned noises?
A very common one, and that's problematic for many reasons, is let's say we have a bass guitar recording, and a few seconds before the part comes in, you hear the person touching the bass, or like some rumble from low end rumble from the bass, or weird noises from the fingers on the strings or the pick or something. That is something that is pretty common, where like 2 or 3 seconds before the take, the bass makes noise.
Yes. And just to make sense of why that's there, listeners, that would be probably your punch-in point, right? So you've selected in the timeline, 10 seconds or a few bars before you're going to start playing, and that's when the recording starts. And in that time, there's just kind of like this living noises of somebody just holding their bass, getting ready to play. And even though it's super quiet generally, it still is like you said, rumble, low end information. There might be as a hum, something like that, and it kicks in usually pretty hard because it's just like a hard chop of when the clip starts, and yeah, that could totally be a problem. That's a great example.
Yeah. Well, what is one that you can think of? Another one?
Mine is vocal stuff. So same idea. They've given some pre-roll, and I find like vocalists generally like the most pre-roll, because they need to like figure out where they are lyrically and kind of get in, maybe sing along with the pre-roll. So they like a longer pre-roll, and sometimes you end up with overlapping takes because of that, or there's like them drinking water, doing vocal exercises, all sorts of weird mouth wet noises like
tapping their foot or something.
Yep. Headphone bleed. There's like just so many noises that happen there. Often them like whispering to the engineer, all right, okay, yeah, this is the spot. Okay, here we go. And then they jump in, and like on the flip side, very occasionally that's cool and like useful, and we can use it, but generally it's not meant to be there, and it's happening while another vocal take is happening or something. So getting rid of that stuff is another like must-do thing for me.
Totally. Very, very common in gang vocals for me too. When people do gang vocals, it's usually the end of the session. Maybe they don't pay as much attention anymore. And then in between the gang shouts, someone is laughing, or some, noise happens in the room or whatever. And it's very often that those are not cleaned up properly. Also because they're kind of an afterthought almost. Sometimes they just, the last day of the session, they do some gang vocals and they just leave them as they are and don't listen to the stuff in between. Maybe they do like a couple of, layers on top of each other without like listening to them in between, and then all kinds of weird noises or people coughing or whatever,
Yeah. Electric guitars generally have like a hum, static kind of sound. Like that's very common as well.
Drummers clicking their sticks together or stuff
Absolutely.
like that.
Yep. Squeak of the drum throne kind of thing, even
or
breathing.
even count-ins that are not supposed to be in the song, that they, where that's something we get actually into, because with those things, it's sometimes kind of hard to know for the mixer then if that is on purpose or not, because it could be, but maybe it's not. And so
absolutely. Yeah. That is one of there's two big reasons that this is a problem, and I guess we should describe that for our audience here as well. Is that the mixer now has to make a creative decision of, is this meant to exist? And sometimes that is confusing. We're not sure. Especially at the beginning of a song. Sometimes like there's a bunch of these kind of noises at the very top of the song, and it's like, okay, was this a creative decision just to kind of sound like, oh, this is like a live recording in a garage, like kind of gritty thing, or am I meant to delete all of this on each track? I have no idea. I just sent off a mix that I cleaned it out, and I hope they don't tell me to put it back in. I really don't know. So that is one big problem of why we're worried about this, is we don't know if it's meant to be there or not. The other is that, of course, in mixing, all of this stuff gets like 100 times louder as it gets compressed and limited. All these things that you maybe didn't even hear, and we're going to talk about how to clean things up you can't hear later in this episode, but all those things you maybe couldn't hear or see in your waveform now are way louder, and you can hear them if you have a discerning ear and you're maybe looking for it, or maybe not. Maybe it becomes so loud that you can't not hear it. and now it's messing with your mix, right?
Yeah.
And I guess there's one third real big reason. And I think that is that now your mixer isn't thinking about mixing. They're now thinking about cleaning up stuff and not mixing. And you've taken them out of a flow state and just generally extended how long it's going to take to do the mix as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, cleanup is not part of mixing. So if I mean, you just said you cleaned the session up, but it would be just fine if to be like, hey, I assume that what you sent me is what you want to have in there, and so I'm going to leave all that stuff in there and send it back that way. And then it's like that would be fine if you do that, because cleaning up is not part of mixing actually, unless you specifically discuss that. And so it causes an extra step and potentially also additional costs if your mixer has to do that. And so just make sure you do it yourself if you can, or if you don't know how to do it, but we'll tell you, it's very easy. Communicate that and just tell the mixer, hey, there's this one thing in there that I couldn't get rid of. Can you fix that for me? That shouldn't be a problem, but just make it clear and just know that the person you're working with might assume that what you sent them is actually what you want to have in there. So if at the beginning of the song, as Malcom said, if there's like amp hum and buzz and all these noise and then a count in or whatever, that could be on purpose. But it could also be that you just didn't get rid of it, and you shouldn't.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
A small reason is also, that is something that I think many people don't know. It helps you if you are struggling with your CPU power with your computer. It might help you to clean up the silence and the noise in between events, because like in between regions, like parts, because when you're running VST3 plugins, at least VST2 can't do it, but VST3 works in a way that when there's no audio region present, when there's an actual gap in between the regions, it doesn't process, like it doesn't do anything, it doesn't run, it doesn't process audio. But if there is an event present, even if it's just noise, then it actually is on and uses processing power. So if you can get rid of all the spots that are not part of the song, you're using less CPU power overall compared to having one big file for every track, even if there's nothing useful on it. Like whenever there's a region, even if there's nothing useful on it, the VST3 plugin will process that. And if there's nothing, if there's a gap, it won't. So you might actually, it will be easier on your CPU if you could just clean that stuff up. So
yes, lets your computer throttle its processing power.
Yeah. Yeah. As we said, it prevents mistakes, misunderstandings when you're working with others. And if you're mixing yourself, it helps you focus on the mix instead of constantly having to go back and fix things as they come up. This is also something. If you mix yourself, you might not think this is necessary, but you want to be in a flow state. You want to worry about the mix and the music, the song, the parts. And while you're at this and you're trying to be creative and you're trying to mix the song, and then all of a sudden there's this noise or there's this clicks and pops or whatever other thing that is distracting, it just interrupts your workflow, and you have to find whatever that was. You have to go, sometimes it's not obvious what it is, sometimes it sounds like it's one thing but it's actually another thing, and then you have to go in and find it, and then you have to clean it up, and by the time you're done with that, you don't know where you actually were in the mix. So you want to be in that flow state, you want to focus on that, and you don't want to be distracted by things like that. I've had that a couple of times. It's really annoying where I listen to a part and I'm like, there's something wrong, there's like something weird, and then I have to go hunting for that, and I have to go through all the tracks, because it could be the kick drum, it could be the bass, it could be some other thing that causes the rumble. So I have to search it, and then once I find it, I have to get rid of it, and it just it's distracting and annoying.
The time-consuming one for me, to give an example, is like when there's like a hard stop before a chorus or something where everything's meant to just go silent. Yeah. But something just doesn't go silent there because it hasn't actually been like cut out. And figuring out what that is, sometimes it's a combination of things, like it's like a click from two different channels that makes like one super bad click. And it's just like, totally, what is this? It sucks.
Totally. Or sometimes I had it where I thought, well, I think that vocal is clipping or distorted or something. Turns out it's not, but in the background there is somebody's touching a guitar string accidentally or something, and it kind of blends in a weird way so that it makes it seem like it's the vocal, or all kinds of weird things. It's just distracting. And if you're mixing yourself, you don't want to sabotage yourself. So do that step first, and then take a quick break, and then move on to mixing it.
Yeah, this is kind of off topic, so excuse me, but it's a bonus tip that isn't in our outline here, and that is that when you're mixing, if you're mixing yourself, you might run into the same problem, and it's really hard to know, but some plugins actually cause noise as well. that isn't very audible while you're listening to what is on the track, say a vocal, like a distortion plug-in on a vocal. The vocal's got distortion, you're happy. But in the silent bits where there's no singing, you might have this noise that can be quite loud, actually. So you have to also clean that out. And I mean, you can commit the track and render it that way, or you can like volume automate those gaps down, or use a gate. There's a bunch of ways, but just wanted to mention that real quick, that this problem persists even into mixing if you're not careful.
Absolutely. Totally right. Totally right. All right. So the good news is, it sounds like a very tedious, thing to do and a lot of manual work, and sometimes it is. But the good news is there is ways to actually make that easy and quick for you, and a couple of things that you might not have used so far or might not even have heard of that we want to talk about. So a bunch of tools and techniques you need to know in order to do that effectively and quickly. And so let's walk you through how to actually do this.
Yeah. I think the first thing you need to do is be able to identify it. 'Cause as mentioned, often the stuff is really quiet and maybe not audible depending on your listening environment. Maybe you can't see it in the waveform. So how do you go looking for this stuff? And I think a lot of the time it is an honest mistake. They see their bit of audio, an audio clip, and that from the take they just did, and it looks like that's what you played, so there's nothing else to worry about. But as we've mentioned, the tops and tails generally have a bunch of stuff that needs to be cut out. I would say pretty well every take you do is going to need some cleanup, which is kind of a crazy realization. But yeah, every time you punch something in, you've probably got to top and tail it, which I'm sure somebody listening is like, really? Everyone? Yeah, everyone. So how I do it, generally when I'm running a session, my waveform is zoomed in to the max, which makes it look like there's just these big blocks of audio. I can't actually distinguish any kind of shape. It's just tubes of audio. But what that does is the quiet bits now look like waveforms. They've been brought up to a spot where they have a shape and I can see them, and the parts that I actually want to keep are just these big bricks of audio because I'm over zoomed. So that is one way, just being able to visually see, hey, what is this little noise here now? We can actually see something's there, solo that track, have a listen, and probably delete. You will get very intuitive at this, where you can pretty well clean up all of your tracks without listening to it. It's just very obvious what is what. You learn what these noises look like on different instruments as well. It'll take you no time. And then, the last method would be just soloing those tracks and turning up your volume a little bit to be like, what is that noise? And if you can't hear it, even at a reasonable listening environment, it probably doesn't need to be there as well, right? So that's another clue. Just clean it out. And all of the methods we're now about to list, Benny and I are probably doing those as we record, not at the end sometime. We're probably cleaning up most of this as we go. Just keep that in mind as we go.
Totally, yeah. If you're doing it on the fly, I want to add that maybe you want to go back and forth between how far you zoom into it, just because, usually we have a proper gain staging and everything, and we make sure nothing clips, and then it's not a problem to zoom in that far. But just make sure you don't, you're not overlooking the level there, because if you zoom in all the way, so that's just these big blocks of audio, you are not able to see any more of a track clip. So just make sure if you're doing it on the fly while you record that you still have an eye on some kind of meter, or you occasionally zoom out just so you see that you actually still have headroom. That's just one thing I want to add. You're not accidentally clipping things because you can't see it anymore.
That is a good note. I've definitely had my old mentor Zach walked into the studio and was just like, whoa, oh, okay, it's fine. It looked like everything was just blown up, but
yeah, totally. Great. So the most basic thing you need to know how to do is to just trim, cut, or split any region, which means you can in most DAWs, you can either grab the ending of a region and you drag it. So you drag it until everything you don't want to have is gone, and you're only left with the bits that you want to keep. So you just grab the beginning or the end of it and you drag it as far as you need to. That's one thing. Cutting means you use, for example, a scissors tool, where you place the tool at the spot where you want to cut, and then you click and you cut it, and then you can delete the stuff that needs to go. Or split at cursor, where the playhead of the session, wherever that is, that cursor, there's a command usually that you can split at that spot where it is right now. This is a very the very bare minimum basic things you need to know. And the shortcuts here are essential. So you need to be able to switch between different tools, for example, between the scissors and the hands or the mouse arrow or whatever your DAW has quickly. Or if you want to split the track at the playhead, you need to know how to do that quickly. You don't want to click around in the menu to do that. You want to be able to just do it without thinking about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like knowing these shortcuts is essential. It shouldn't slow your session down. You should be able to clean these up before, like the singers, for example, to say there's a singer wanting to do another take. You should have the take you just did cleaned up before they're ready to move on and do the next one. It should be that quick. I have a couple shortcuts for trim to playhead. So I just if there's the silence before the take starts that I want to delete, kind of quotation mark silence. It's not silent, as we know now. I will click where I am happy with the start actually being, and I can click one button and it deletes everything up until that point. Stuff like that. There's a bunch of editing tools built into your DAW. Your DAW is way more powerful than you think it is. So you just got to figure out, if you can imagine it in this kind of world, on how to clean tracks faster, your DAW can probably do it. You just have to figure out how.
Totally. One thing to double check is whether or not you have some sort of snap to grid or snap to region or snap to playhead or whatever thing turned on and off. Because I've had it where people were asking me, hey, I want to get rid of this in the noise in the beginning, but I can't because whenever I get close to it, it sort of snaps and then I'm I'm cutting into the actual take, and so how do I do this? And sometimes it's just people have this on, and so it could be set to snap to grid, for example, which means that you can't freely decide how far you want to trim, but it will only go to like a certain note value, or it will automatically snap to wherever the playhead is, or it will snap to the next region or something.
Tempo of the song usually, right?
Yeah. And if you have that on, then it's hard. Like so make sure, just double check if you have that on or off. Maybe you want it to be on, so you can trim exactly to the beginning of a bar or whatever. But just be intentional about this. And if you're wondering why you can't freely decide what you want to cut, that it might be because of that.
Yeah, in Pro Tools, there's grid mode, which is you can only click on the grid of the tempo map, and then there's slip mode, where you can click anywhere. And I'm sure that there's different names for that in different DAWs. Yeah. So that's a absolutely essential ground level piece of knowledge you have to figure out.
Totally. Then there is something that you brought up last time we talked about. The idea for this episode, actually, Malcom, that is strip silence. This could be a game changer for a lot of people because it saves you so much time if you know what that is. Go ahead and explain how it works.
Yeah, I literally just released a video on my YouTube channel for strip silence. And again, strip silence is the name of this feature in Pro Tools. It might be the same in some DAWs, but I think in Logic, for example, I think it's remove silence is the function. So it's a little different, but again, you'll be able to find it. And here's what it is. It is a way to select a whole region of audio. Let's say a whole vocal track. So start to finish of the song, a vocal that was sent to me. We can picture one WAV file consolidated. And what this strip silence feature will do is allow me to set a threshold for a certain volume, and anything that's below that threshold, like a gate kind of would work, I can remove those bits of audio. But it doesn't just turn down those bits of audio like a gate would. It actually deletes them from the waveform. So I'm actually removing, I'm cutting up chunks with one button essentially. So you can set the threshold of audio for the volume that you're looking for, and you can add little top and tail parameters for how much extra space you want on either side. You can actually do the opposite and cut out the loud stuff and leave the quiet stuff. It's a very incredibly useful tool that can clean up a whole track with a couple clicks rather than manually going through and having to punch in a bunch of stuff. On the flip side, though, if it's a very dynamic take, it can also be slower. So you kind of have to get good at it and then figure out when to use it and when not to use it. But yeah, insanely useful tool that I use pretty much every time I get a mix sent to me. Even when they are cleaned, I have to do a little bit.
Yeah, totally. You got to be careful to not get rid of something that you actually want to have in there. Sometimes part of the stuff you want to keep is quieter than some of the noise, and then strip silence doesn't work as well.
Exactly. Like a vocal breath. If you want to keep your breaths in, you got to be careful.
Yeah, exactly. But usually it's a pretty cool thing, and like it speeds up your workflow with guitars. For example, if you have distorted guitars, works very well. And if even if you just have a great start, just to have a great starting point, maybe set the threshold a little higher, get rid of most of it, and then fine tune the details.
Yeah, exactly. Totally a skill worth knowing.
Yeah. Now, whatever technique you're using, whenever you do any sort of cutting, trimming, whatever. Make sure that you add fades at the beginning and endings of those regions, or when you join two regions together, make sure that there's a crossfade. And the reason for that is that if you don't do it, you'll have clicks and pops all over your tracks. Because if you cut into the waveform and you don't add a fade, it will just click the moment the thing ends. And if a new one starts, it's exactly the same thing. And so just make sure you add fades. Add fades. That's it. And you don't have to add manually. Like if you do a bunch of edits and then you don't have to go in and add a fade manually to all the endings and the beginnings. There's usually a function that lets you batch that where you can just select a couple of regions and then you do batch fades. You can say add a fade in and a fade out to all of these regions and make this fade exactly 5 milliseconds long or whatever. And then you have it in one go.
Yeah. Yeah,
same for crossfades.
Just highlight the selection, maybe the entire track even, and do all the fades with a couple clicks rather than manually kind of jogging along the timeline. And yeah, it'll save you so much time. Batch fades are the way.
And we're talking really, in this case, like inaudible, super short fades. It's not a long fade out. It's just 5 to 10 milliseconds or something, or it's just something that it doesn't click. Basically, you don't want to hear it as a fade. It's just so to prevent the noise. There's also a feature I never used that because I don't know. I kind of want to have control over these things. But there's auto fade features, I think, in Cubase as well, where you can, if you select in Cubase, if you select a track if you enable auto fade on that track, I think it automatically fades out every region on that track. And you can set a value for that, and I assume it works. But for whatever reason, I'd like to see the fades, and I want to have control over them. So I don't use it. But
I can see that being useful. I think I would set it as literally as the short a value, 1 millisecond as I could, probably.
Just in case you forget or something.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You use that? Is that a thing in
Pro
Tools?
No, I don't think that's a feature in Pro Tools, but I think I would use it. And I don't think I would rely on it, but as a safety, I think having as short as possible, just to avoid any pops, would be useful. I like that idea.
Yeah. Then there is one thing where sometimes a fade doesn't work. For example, if you have a sustained note and it's not long enough and you have to take a section of that note and copy and paste it to make it longer, or stretching doesn't work or whatever. Sometimes you just want to cut in, for whatever reason. If you cut during a sustained note, sometimes if you add a fade there, it's still obvious no matter the shape or size of the fade. You can still hear this little bump, and it's not this fluent thing, or you can just hear the cut. And sometimes what you need to do then is to not do a fade and to just join the two parts together. And if you have to do it without a fade, then what you need to do is you have to find a zero crossing in the waveform, which means the waveform goes up and down, and there's a line in the middle where it crosses zero. And if you cut exactly at the point where the waveform crosses this zero point, if you cut exactly there, you don't get any clicks or pops because there's no energy. At this moment, the speaker doesn't move in or out, so it's just silence. And if you cut exactly there, you shouldn't get any clicks or pops. And so if you do that on the ending of one track and the beginning of the other track, and then you join the two together at exactly the zero crossing, it should work without any fades. And sometimes you need to do that. It's very rare that I have to, but sometimes it's the way to go. So if for whatever reason fades sound weird or don't work, or a crossfade is not an option, you have to cut at the zero crossing. And there's a feature actually in most DAWs, I think, in Cubase at least there is, where it lets you snap to a zero crossing. So if you just hover over with the scissors tool over the waveform, or you move the playhead over the waveform, it automatically snaps to the zero crossings basically, and then lets you find it automatically, and then you can cut exactly there.
That's another feature I'm not sure exists in Pro Tools. I'm going to write that down to look up. That'd be handy.
Yeah. Automatically does, because if you do it by manually, sometimes you don't hit it exactly right, and the snap to zero crossing lets you make sure that it's exactly the zero crossing, and then you can cut without any fade and it doesn't cause any noise.
Yeah, I'll look that up. That's a great idea.
Cool. Now, something you need to be careful with. There's two things that come to mind. One is be careful to not cut into any transients. That's especially true with guitars because, again, if you don't zoom in fully, or if you're looking at a DI track, for example, that hasn't gone through an amp yet, you might not see the transient, or it might not be as obvious. You might see what you think is the transient, but the pick attack is actually a little earlier. So if you clean stuff up, just make sure you don't cut too far into the signal. And I've seen that a lot, where, especially with guitars, where people would cut into the pick attacks constantly, especially at the beginning of parts. And you really destroy the impact of a part if you do that. So just make sure you leave enough space. You want to get rid of everything that you don't want, but leave enough space so that the pick attack is still intact. And you need to, again, zoom in a lot and just know that the pick attack is usually before the waveform really goes up, where it looks like a transient.
Yeah, distorted guitars in particular, it's deceiving.
Yeah, just make sure you don't ruin that. And the other thing that comes to mind is, there's some, just so you don't get this wrong. For example, there's some tracks that you might be thinking, now I need to clean that up, but you don't. So, for example, drums. If you have multi-track drums, don't think you have to get rid of everything in between every snare hit, for example, or whatever.
Yes.
This is bleed that is part of the drum performance. I mean, sometimes you want to cut out, for example, parts in between toms. That's something we sometimes do, where instead of a noise gate, we could clean up tom tracks and only leave the actual tom hits in there. But I'm intentional about this. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't do it. But don't think you have to go in and cut out everything in between kick drum hits or snare drum hits or whatever. Don't do it. Leave that stuff in. That's you're recording the drums as a big sort of instrument that belongs together, and everything on every mic creates that sound, including the stuff in between the hits. So that's a different story. But everything else, basically a guitar track, a vocal track, or something, clean that stuff up. But with multi-mic'd ensembles, whatever, or anything where there's multiple mics on one source, don't clean up the mics individually, I'd say. Do it as a whole.
Yeah. I think even you mentioned toms, or sometimes a ride mic will get cleaned. So the ride channel's only live when there's a ride. That's called, that we also say cleaning tracks in that case.
Yeah.
But it's, as a rule of thumb, that sort of thing I wouldn't recommend doing unless you're mixing it yourself and that's how you want it. As a mixer, I would rather make that decision myself, hearing the drum tracks.
Yeah, because that's not getting rid of noise. That's making a sonic decision and deciding if the bleed is adding something that you want or not. But that is not getting rid of noise, because it's still part of the drum performance. You're not cutting things out that don't belong in there. We're talking about the stuff that really doesn't belong in there. Yeah. Cool. Anything else? I mean, that's a pretty quick and kind of basic thing, but super important.
I think that's a really good. I think we covered why it's important, and how to find it and how to deal with it as well. And the best part is put a little bit of time into being quick at getting cleaning your tracks, and you will become more proficient at just navigating your DAW in general, which is always a good thing. It makes you able to record yourself and create faster and more smoothly. So that is always the goal.
Great. Let us know if you want more of these seemingly basic episodes, because sometimes people have questions where they think it's dumb to ask or too basic or whatever. And we think we should, I think at least, we should we should probably do more of these, because sometimes we are covering things that are exciting to us, and but I remember when I was starting out, I had a lot of these basic questions, or I did a lot of things wrong because I just didn't know I was even making these mistakes. So if you have any basic thing that you're struggling with, or seemingly basic thing you're struggling with, let us know, and we're happy to do these kind of episodes, because apparently even more advanced people still get it wrong sometimes. And
absolutely, yeah. No, I think it's super important. And there's no question that's not worth asking, especially in this community. That's, everybody's welcome here. So ask anything that you need help with.
Absolutely. All right. Then, as always, thank you for listening, and we're looking forward to talking to you next week.
Take care. Bye.